What's up guys, Luke back again with another video, and today we are going to be tearing down, cleaning, repasting, and putting back together a PS4 Pro model CUH-7015B. If you like this kind of content and you want to see more of it, show me by hitting that thumbs up button, as well as clicking subscribe with bell notifications turned on so you can catch me every time I post a new video. But with that being said, we got a whole lot of work ahead of us. So let's stop dilly-dallying around and get right into it. All right, now that we're sat down at our workbench, it's time to start tearing down this PS4 and get it ready for cleaning. The first thing that we're gonna do is pull off the hard drive cover. It's a little plastic piece. This one kind of fought me a little bit. I've torn down quite a few PS4 Pros over the last few years, and this one really kind of fought me. So I ended up using a spudger tool to pop that piece off, but you should be able to do it with your fingers. Most of them come off pretty easily. I'm just assuming that maybe this one sat in the sun a little bit and it kind of baked in, and it was just fighting me, but should be able to peel it right off. And then after that, you can remove the Phillips screw that holds the hard drive in. That is a Phillips, I want to say Phillips 1 screw. You can take that out, and then you can slide the hard drive, will slide freely out. And then once that is done, you can begin to take off the warranty stickers. There's a couple here, so make sure you take your time. I use an Exacto knife to pull those off. Once those labels are off, now it's time to start removing the black Torx bit screws that are on the back side underneath those labels. And these are T9 Torx bit screws. All right, so at this point, we've removed a couple of screws. We have removed 2 warranty labels, and we have screws out. We want to remember where these screws go, so I highly, highly, highly recommend that you have some sort of organization to your screws. It doesn't have to be exactly what I do. It is recommended that you do what I do. The mat that I have here and the dry erase marker didn't cost more than 10 or 20 bucks to make happen, and it's a magnetic mat. You can organize everything, but I would highly recommend that you have as high an organization as possible, so when you put this thing back together, you know where every single screw goes. So I'm gonna draw on my little mat here sort of a terrible picture, because I'm not an artist, of the back end of the PS4, and I'm going to be doing this maybe not on camera, but throughout the entire process of this repair. So highly recommend you have good organization when you do this, because there are a ton of freaking screws in the PS4 Pro. Once that is started and begun, now it's time to move back to the PS4 and start to peel that bottom piece out. There are a few clips that kind of hold it in place in the middle center part, so just make sure those are free, and you just kind of peel that back piece back, or you peel it out, and then it hooks in from the front, so you peel it out, and then you push kind of down, and you release that bottom piece. With that bottom panel out of the way, now it's time to take out a outrageous amount of screws. So going back to what I said earlier, organization is key. I draw out on my little pad kind of a estimate of what is going on here, and then I will put points on the image that I draw for where the screws go. And then when the screws come out, they go on top of those points. So it's a hyper way of organizing, but you're gonna thank me later when you go back to put everything in its proper place, and you won't end up with extra screws or screws in the wrong place. Once we have all the screws out, now we can start disconnecting the ribbons and antennas. The antennas are pretty simple. I just kind of grab them by their head and just lift them up and they'll disconnect from their connector. And both black ones need to be kind of like unrouted, mainly the one over by your hard drive. That one's kind of threaded through, so your top casing is not going to come off unless you kind of unthread them, for lack of a better term. So go ahead and do that. Also, you have quite a few ribbon cables. It looks like you have a total of 6, as well as 1 fan connector that we want to remove. So kind of count them up. You have 6 ribbon cables you need to remove. Most of these ribbon cables are sort of like pressure fit, so they just kind of squeeze in and they slide into place. One, however, is the laser ribbon cable, and that one is a locking mechanism connector. It's very simple to pull it off. You just can take your fingernail, if it's long enough, or a spudger tool, and just kind of get under that connector and flip it upward. Be very careful though, because it is easy to damage this stuff. So really take your time and do it right. Don't regret it later. Okay, next part is the heatsink panel cover thing. It's not a heatsink, and it's an aluminum panel. It's an aluminum panel that protects the clamp that holds the heatsink. How's that? There's quite a few black screws that surround that, so we're just going to draw that out on our organization pad and make sure that we get those screws back when we put it back together. Once those 8 screws are taken out, that panel should flip right up, and it should take thermal pads with it. This is very important, guys. Make sure that those thermal pads are with the panel when it comes off. If some are on the motherboard and some are on the panel, you're gonna have an issue later on, because I guarantee you, as you're working, one of them's gonna get lost, and if you don't have spares, you're gonna have a RAM chip that is a very important part of your motherboard. You're gonna have that without proper thermal dissipation. So you want to make sure that those are all together. I put them on the little panel, or you can leave them on the motherboard, but make sure that they are accounted for and organized. Maybe even take them off both and put them into a baggie and put them to the side, and maybe even label the baggie top side motherboard thermal pads or something like that. But just make sure those are back on it when you put it back together. All right, so once that panel is off, you'll be greeted with an X clamp, as well as a little spacer that goes between the X clamp and the motherboard. Pretty straightforward. Pull the 4 screws out, lift that X clamp up, but when you do lift the spacer up, make sure you do not lift it up at an angle. Lift it straight up, because it's possible that you can break one of the legs on that, and that's just never good. All right, with that done, I did have a couple of connectors I still needed to disconnect, but that is about as far as we can go on this side until a little bit later. So we're gonna flip the PS4 Pro back over, and we're gonna peel that top piece off, and this one comes off in a very similar fashion. It peels off from the front this time, and it comes off kind of on an angle, and then you just slide it out. Okay, so now we got this panel off, and we're greeted with more screws. What do you know? Who would have thought, right? More screws. So we're gonna pull off the power supply first. That one has a couple of Torx bit screws and a couple of Phillips 1 screws. So we're gonna go ahead and get those all off, and then we can lift the power supply up and out. All right, so once that power supply comes up and out, there is a connector that holds the power supply to the motherboard, and this is very delicate, guys. I've seen people rip the connector out of the motherboard, and it was an absolute nightmare. Trace repair, all that stuff. You do not want to mess with that. So take your time and go slow. There's a a connector that is connected, as you can see on the screen, you're just gonna kind of pinch the wire as close to the connector as you can and just lightly kind of wiggle it back and out. Do not force anything. If it won't come out, just kind of take your time and work at it, but do not force anything. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and leave the connector connected to the motherboard just to save a step a little bit later on. And once again, you can remove that, just take your time and go slow. Once that is out, now the motherboard is basically loose. We can lift this up at an angle, just like the top and bottom panel. Lift these up at an angle, up and out. Make sure, double check before you do this. Make sure everything's disconnected, but it should just lift up and out. All right, now with that motherboard up and out of the way, we have our final little metal RF shielding heat sink thingamajiggy to pull out. It's held down by two tiny little screws that are connected to the chassis. Note though, there are two more screws that you do not have to take out, so just ignore those screws. They're right next to where the thermal compound is that connect to the heat sink. You do not have to worry about those, just leave them in, and just take those two tiny screws that connect the main body of it to the chassis. Just take those out and it should slide right out. Quick little note, we do have some more thermal pads on this metal base, so just make sure that those are organized and they go back where they're supposed to go when you put it back together. Now we get a good look at the heat sink, and this is basically what does most of the cooling work along with your fan. So the heat sink will has a bunch of tiny aluminum fins, and they kind of fan out like they have some depth to them. And the heat it's designed so the heat will go into those fins, and the fan will blow air through the fins out of the back of the console, in turn cooling the console down. But over time, with just dust and particles in the air, they get sucked into through the side vents, and they get pushed through that heat sink, and the heat sink will eventually become clogged. This one is not too bad. It's good that we're getting to it now, but you may have a much more ugly situation in your hands when you pull yours out. But you don't have to worry about that. This is why you're doing this, is to get this thing cleared out. So now that you get this piece removed, you can spray this with some canned air. You can spray it with an air compressor, but get all that dust blown out of there and out of the way, so that when you put it back together, it'll be back to almost stock as far as cooling goes. Okay, so now we're starting to get to the home stretch here, guys. Next is the fan. There's two screws that hold the fan in. Those come out, and so does the fan. Okay, so now it's time to get the drive out. Drive is held into the chassis with 4 screws. One is a black long screw in the back left corner. I guess it depends on how you're looking at it, but if you're facing the front of it, it's in the back left corner. Pull that one out, and then the 3 silver screws as well, and that whole piece should slide right out. Okay, and once the drive is out, we got 3 more screws that we got to remove, and these basically just hold a center trim piece to the chassis, which in turn holds the front ribbon connectors. These ribbon connectors do various things: power button, eject button, as well as an LED light panel. So we want to pull those out because we're going to be washing this center chassis in water, so we want to make sure all electronics are disconnected from it. And after a little bit of finagling, that centerpiece is free, exposing a few more, you guessed it, screws. We got to pull the screws off that connect the ribbon cable boards to the chassis, and those should all come free as well. Okay, quick little word to the wise. Take special care of these ribbon cables. There's 3 different ribbon cables connected to 3 different PCB panels. If you can, leave them connected, and when you put it back, you'll know exactly where each one goes. But definitely take care of these because it's an absolute nightmare trying to figure out later what goes where. So just a little bit of a pro tip here. Make sure you keep track of what ribbon cable goes to what board. Now, after all that is done, finally, we take out the 2 Torx bit screws that are holding in each antenna. Just take a picture of this before you start doing it, just so you know how to route the antenna when it goes back in. Don't just assume you're going to be able to figure it out because it can get very confusing, the routing of everything. So take a picture of it, use your phone frequently, actually throughout this entire process. Be using your phone so that you know when you go back, okay, this is how it goes. The more complicated it looks, the more complicated it's going to be when you try to put it all back together. So you'll thank yourself and me for suggesting to do this. All right, so now all the plastic pieces are free, and this is an optional thing. I guess you don't technically have to do this, but I always do it because it makes the console look like close to brand new when it gets put back together. It's got that clean feeling on it. I'll blow out all the plastic trim pieces and then I will wash them with some cleaning spray of like whatever your favorite spray is and a nylon brush. So you can use a old toothbrush or you can get one of those black nylon brush kits from Harbor Freight. Just don't use the metal ones, of course. And we're just gonna spray it down really, really good. Just douse it with cleaning spray and then scrub it from top to bottom, getting into all the cracks and crevices. Take your time and do a good job because you'll thank yourself later. After that's all done, we're going to wipe it down with some microfiber cloths and then spray it out with our air compressor. Just continue to spray it until you don't see any water. If you still see water droplets, guess what? You're not done spraying. Keep spraying, spraying, spraying because you do not want any moisture left over in this case when you put it back together. After that point, you are going to want to do a couple of things with the console as you're waiting for those plastic pieces to dry. And the first thing is to open up your disk drive and make sure that it's nice and clean inside of there. So the first thing you're going to need to do with your drive is take it apart. There is 2 screws, Phillips screws, that are holding it into place. And once those 2 screws are out, what do you know? This one tilts up and out, very similar to all the other parts that have almost all the other parts that we've removed from here. You want to tip it up at an angle and pull it out. Something to note here, when you put it back in, make sure that the metal bracket is slid underneath that plastic clip in the bottom right corner of this picture. So there's a little hook that the top piece slides under. So just make sure it's in there and it's flush. If it's not flush, don't start screwing it down. You just probably have it on there wrong. Maybe try again, because if you screw it all down back together wrong, you're gonna have issues down the line. So make sure you put it back together right before you put it all back together, because this thing is at the very end. There's no way to pull this drive back out if you put it back together wrong. So make sure you take your time with this and you pay close attention, because it'll save you better part of an hour and a half. If you have a microscope or a magnifying glass, maybe get up on the lens. Just make sure the lens is clean. Don't just assume that it's dirty, because anytime you clean a lens of any kind, you aren't going to leave it the same way that it was as far as like scratches. It's very easy to scratch these things. So my rule of thumb is if I don't have to touch it, I won't. So just inspect it. If you were having laser reading issues before, then maybe you want to focus on it more and possibly clean it. But if you do clean it, what I like to do is use a microfiber cloth or a like glasses level cloth and a little bit of lens cleaning spray and just lightly brush across it. I do not use cotton swabs. Cotton swabs, in my experience, especially inspecting it under a microscope, have done more damage than good. They scratch the lens because they have a little bit of an abrasive material in that cotton, and it's just not the best way to go about cleaning these things. So use a microfiber cloth and some lens cleaner and you'll be very happy with that. So okay, so now that we're done with the drive, it's time to move over to the motherboard and repaste that APU unit that is oh so important to keep cool. And now it's time to remove the old thermal paste. So I have my little isopropyl dropper that I'm gonna spray all over the heatsink, the copper pad that touches the APU unit. And we're gonna get all that old thermal paste nice and cleaned up. And we're gonna do the exact same thing on the motherboard side. Once that's done, we're gonna take our MX4 or your thermal compound of choice and spread it evenly across the top of that APU unit so that when we lay it back down on top of the heatsink, it creates a nice, beautiful seal, probably better than the OEM seal that was just onto the chip and squeezed together as they cranked out hundreds and millions of PS4s. And once that's done, so are you. Well, halfway done. It's time now to put everything back together. We're going to time lapse this so that this video isn't freaking way too long. It already is too long. You can pause as you go, and if you have any questions at all, feel free to ask me in the comment section and I'll be happy to answer any of your questions, guys. Appreciate it. And once you get it all back together, you can pull your organization bin / mat and look at it and make sure there's no screws left. There shouldn't be any left if you did proper organization. And then that is it, ladies and gentlemen. You just tore down, cleaned out, repasted, and put back together your PS4 Pro. Should be running much cooler, should be reading games now. If it isn't reading games, you probably need to replace the laser, unfortunately, so you may need to get a new one, and it's up for you to decide going into it if you want to reopen this thing. I personally do it because I'm cheap, but if you want to just replace the laser while you're in there, because it is a whole lot of work to get back into it, you're more than welcome to do that. But you should be good just cleaning it. In most cases, you should be pretty happy with the overall quality of the console after this. Well, when it's all said and done, the PS4 Pro model CUH-7015B is one heck of a console and has one heck of a lot of screws in it. If you survived this whole thing, let me know by smashing that like button, as well as subscribing with bell notifications turned on. And I want to hear from you guys down below. How did things go? Are you having issues with your PS4 Pro overheating, or is it having trouble reading games? Let me know in the comment section. And last of all, guys, if you ever need help with anything you're doing, I absolutely love it when you guys post it down in the comment section, and I will get to it as soon as I can and try to help you along the way of this path to self-repair and DIY repair. So let me know in the comment section down below. If you'd like to support this channel monetarily, we have a Patreon link in the description down below, so you can check that one out. And finally, we do actually stream. All of these videos have been streamed live on Twitch, so if you want to come and hang out with us, the link is down in the description as well. It's twitch.tv/theprayinggamer. Go and check it out, and we would love to see you there. But that's gonna do it for me, guys. Luke from 8-Bit Plus signing out, and I'll see you in the next one. God bless.